How y'all doing? Dog back here again, and it is time. It is time to leverage the Sneks, the power of the Sneks. If you know anything about some of the more popular Go packages, you'll know what I'm talking about. There's a dynamic duo that tend to get used very frequently together to create very powerful CLI applications. One of them's being called one's called Cobra and one's called Viper. Cobra is used to like build out the actual like command line interface, like all the different commands you can run. Viper is used to do to do the configuring of the program, because Viper is very flexible about how you can configure your program. So today we're going to talk about Viper. So before we get started, be sure to like subscribe on wherever you're watching this, and be sure to share the video if you like it. And with that, let's get with the Snek. Don't step on Snek. We use Snek. So as you can see, a brief description of what Viper is. It's a complete configuration solution for Go. Designed to work within an application, can handle a whole lot of different configuration setups. You can use the set defaults, read from pretty much all like popular config file formats, live watching and rereading of the config file, which is pretty handy. Read from environment variables, read from remote config systems, which I've never actually tried, which actually sounds really nifty. Read from command line flags, read from a buffer, and then setting explicit values. So from the examples I'm going to show you, we're going to set defaults, we're going to read from a file, we're going to do live watching and rereading, and that's all I'm really going to touch on right now, because the rest of this stuff is pretty similar. We'll do the environment variables thing too, maybe, but we'll get to that part maybe. But the rest of the stuff is fairly similar to when you would use it normally. So let's get started, shall we? So if you see, it's talking about how to establish defaults, and you after you import Viper, you're gonna do set default, and then the key, and then the value, just like that. So let me bring up my notes on the side here. So we have a empty file. I have already initialized this directory as a Go module, and I have already grabbed the Viper package. So to start off, we're gonna need that package. So I'm gonna do import github.com. I can't spell today. SPF13/Viper. So let's just set the defaults first. So the way that they were kind of doing it is like this, where you're like Viper set default key value, like that, right? But I don't really like that much, because you have to like do it like line by line by line. That's kind of annoying. So a way I like to handle this is we're gonna create some variables here at the top, and one of them is gonna have this list called defaults. Excuse me, and it's gonna be a map of string keys with anything values. And this configuration is going to look very similar to something you would use to connect to a database. So it's going to have a username, and default's going to be admin, and the password is going to default to password1. It's going to need a host, and it's going to default to localhost. It needs a port, which I'm going to default to 3306. Yay, MySQL. And the database name is going to default to test, like that. Okay, this is good. So instead of doing this like writing it one by one thing, we're going to do this a smarter way. So we're going to do for k v equals range over defaults. I'm going to do viper.set default key value. That allows you to set all your defaults without you having to sit there and write out like, 5, 10, 20 lines of code. Now we've set our defaults, but now we actually want to read in a file. So if we go back over here real fast, there's a section about this, and there's kind of like a little process you tend to follow. First, you want to set the name of your configuration file. In this example, they just call config. If you're, as it reads here, if the configuration file does not have an extension in the name, you set what type it is, which in this case they're doing YAML. I actually have a config file setting in that directory, but it's actually a TOML file. And since it's called TOML, I don't need to specify this config type. And then you basically add in some paths to look for. If you've used terminal programs before, you know it's not uncommon to have a couple of different paths they look for configuration files. The like system-wide one tends to set an etc, like this example. A more user-specific one would be in their home directory, and then they also have one where it's just looking in the working directory of wherever you ran the program from. I'm only going to use this one because I don't really have a need to do these other ones. But just so you know ahead of time, if you do this, adding multiple config paths to look for the configuration file, it looks for it in the order they're added. So since this one was added first, it'll look here first, and then this one, and then this one. So let's do that now, shall we? So I'm going to say, I'm actually going to put this in as a variable up at the top. I'm going to say config name equals, oh, I know why this is complaining. This is, I have this defined out here. Go away. That's why it was complaining at me. Config name, I'm just going to call it config, just like that. And then config paths, I'm just going to say it's a slice. Now, normally your slice would have more than one value in it, but in my case, it's just going to have dot, just like that. And so we got these now. Are you playing at me? I think you're just complaining. Okay, whatever. So now we are going to do Viper read. Or no, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. Set config name to be config name. And we're here, and I'm going to do, so I need a path. So I'm going to do this the way I handle the defaults, which allows you to not have to sit there and write out like multiple lines of code like we did before. We're going to do for, I don't care about the index, p equals range over config paths. Do viper.add config path p. That will add all the configuration paths that you're trying to get. And then finally, now that we've done this, we're going to do error equals viper.read in config. And if error does not equal nil, we're going to do log.fatal f could not read config file be error, just like that. And so let me go ahead and run this to see if it will throw an error. We're going to go run main. Okay, so it didn't throw an error, so everything should be fine. Sometimes the tools that I have here on Vim for Go start to wig out with the syntax highlight. It's highlighting like there's an error. So we have it did not throw an error, so our config was loaded. Now something I didn't show you is I didn't actually show you what the config file looks like. So it's in this config.toml, and it just has 3 values in it. It has username, password, and host. Now you recall that we have 5 values in our config, but this only has 3. So we're going to see if those 2 missing values are actually in the configuration. So there's 2 different ways to, let me close that out now. Close out. 2 different ways to approach getting the values back out of Viper. The one way is just to explicitly grab them from Viper, and I'll show you how to do that. So we're going to do fmt print f, and I'm going to say host name from Viper equals %s, and I'm going to do viper.getString. Then you pass in the key of the value we want. So in this case, it is, wait, I don't want host name, I want username. My bad. Username, there we go. And so I went too far. username, just like that. So let's run that and see if that works. Yep. Username from Viper Dylan. Now, that makes sense because our default is admin, but we actually had a value in our config file set to Dylan. So it did actually correctly read it in from the config file. So let's do the other one. So we're going to do fmt printf, what was it, password from Viper. You'll see why I'm specifically saying from Viper here in a little bit. %s Viper get string password, just like that, and we're going to run that just to double check it to some pass, because that was another entry. I think now we're going to get to one. No, I think the entries that didn't have anything were the last two. Okay, fine enough. Printf, this would be host from Viper, %s Viper dot get string host, and run this again. Okay, it's just, basically it's localhost again, but it's just with the actual IP representation rather than just saying localhost. Now we're going to get to the two that I did not actually have values for. fmt printf port from Viper %d, because this is a number, Viper get int. That's what it is, and port. And we'll run this 3306. So I did not have a value for that one yet. It was set from the defaults. And then the last one is going to be fmt printf. What was that? It was database from Viper %s Viper.get string database. Just like that. Run that, and bam. Okay, so we have our full config ready to go. Now this is fine, but you know, I really like to work with the native types in Go, like structs and stuff. Conveniently enough, one of the things you can do is all this data that you've pulled in from a config file and that's stored in Viper, you can unmarshal it out to a struct. Yep. So let's actually define a struct that has the same shape as our configuration. So I'm gonna have type config struct, and just like the same keys that our configuration has, we're gonna have username is a string, password is a string, host string, port int, and database string, just like that. So now I'm going to leave those there so you can still tell the difference. But now I'm going to do var config is an instance of our config, and I'm going to do error equals viper.unmarshal there. And we pass in a pointer to our variable we want to unmarshal the data into. And we're going to check to make sure that that was right. If it could not unmarshal the data, it will throw an error. We're going to do log fatal f could not decode config into struct %b error, like that. And now let's run that real fast, make sure we don't get any errors. Okay, no errors, so it unmarshaled successfully. And let's start printing this stuff out now. So I'm gonna copy all this mess here down here. Instead of Viper, I'm going to actually get it from the struct. So I'm going to change this to from struct. I'm going to get rid of like all this. So change up to open parentheses. Yeah, okay. And I'm just going to call config username, just like that. I'm running out of. I didn't. Yep. Or did I? No, I didn't. Okay. Good. So I could do all of these, but it seems kind of redundant. So let's. I'm actually just going to get rid of these other ones just to demonstrate that this struct is here. We're gonna actually, it'd be easier if I just print out the whole struct. We could do that too. Let's just do that too. We're gonna do printf. I'm gonna say config struct is %b new line. I'm just gonna say config. So now we're just going to look at the entire config too. So I'm going to run this, and we see username from struct Dylan and config struct, and you'll see it has all the same values that we were pulling from Viper. I just find this more convenient to use than constantly calling Viper get string, Viper get in, blah 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 blah. I just find this better. So now we've read it in, and we've set our defaults. Now let's watch for when the file changes, right? So I'm going to do one other thing here now. I'm going to create or have a variable here called changed equals false. You'll see why. We're going to call a function on the Viper package called watch config. Now what this will do is it will basically watch the directories that you specified that your configs were in, and when it notices that one of those files changes, it will first thing it'll do is reread the file back into Viper. So it'll have the new whatever your variables were that you changed in your config. It will be available in Viper basically like immediately. And the second thing it'll do if you've done this is we can call another function on here called viper.onConfigChange. And you can pass in a function here that takes in a argument of, was it fs notify notify.event, which is file system notify. And this is a function that will fire when your configuration file changes. So what I want to do is, not only do I want, we already have the updated data in Viper itself, I want this same data unmarshaled back out into our struct. So I'm going to do error equals viper.unmarshal, and I'm going to pass in our config struct again. If error does not equal nil, let's go say log dot. I'm not going to do fatal this time. I'm just going to do f. Could not decode config after change. Percent b error, and then lastly, I'm going to set change to true. And the reason we're going to do that is because I'm going to enter into a loop here while change is false. And we're just going, I'm going to sleep for 1 second so it doesn't just vomit out stuff out of the console. A second, just like that. And I'm just going to print out the struct like I did before. So I'm going to, what did I do? Copy this and put it down here. It's awful. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to run this. It's going to go into a loop. This is going to keep printing this, right? So I'm going to open up that, oops, that's wrong. I just said the same thing. We're going to open up that config file. Let's change the username from Dylan to Bob, or Bob. And you will see that after it picked it up, it did unmarshal it back out to the struct, printed it out, and since change was set to true now, it exits the loop and we quit printing out instantly. So there you go. Now at this point, we have read in the config. I'm not really going to go over this one, but I will show you where this could be useful. And we have been watching and rereading. This just demonstrates how to read from like a byte slice. This is how you explicitly set values to like override them. Where was it? So the reason that where this write config file I think would be most useful, there's two situations. One is this one, which is if whenever you go to read in your config file, it can throw an error. And one of the types of that error could be is config file not found. This, I think, error you might want to handle a little differently sometimes. Such as, let's say this is the first time that you've ran your program and that config file just doesn't exist yet. Well, when you run this and it goes, there's no config file. What you could do is, those defaults that I had written out into a variable, you could take those and actually use the write config file to write this back out. So that way there would be a config file in the future that you could read from. Be guaranteed to be there unless the user got rid of it later. And the what was the other thing I was going to talk about that's useful? I think it was something to do with the right config file stuff. Oh, right. So it's also very common if you're interacting with a remote service like YouTube or anything where you could use OAuth, where you are going to need to retrieve and probably store something like an auth token for you to use. This is where this also becomes very handy too. So what you can do is after you've kind of did the whole OAuth handshake stuff and retrieve your tokens, you can use write config files to store them into like a config file or a cache file or something. That way you don't have to redo the whole process later. So I think that's all. That was all I was going to show you right now. Environment variables. I'll just kind of go over that real fast because I don't think I have any environment variables set up. Yeah, so the main thing you're going to want to use a lot of the time is this automatic env. Because here's the explanation. Powerful helper, especially when combined with set env prefix, which what set env prefix does is when you try to load environment variables, it will specifically look for ones that match that prefix and load them in. Because it's very common that if you have environment variables set for a specific program, that you prefix them with the program. An example with this would be, I think it's the Docker image for MySQL. There are a couple of environment variables that MySQL will use when that image starts up, and I can probably imagine where, say, you have where they're all it's only looking for environment variables that are prefixed with like MySQL, something like that. It says when called, Viper will check for an environment variable anytime a viper.get request is made. It will apply the following rules. It will check for an environment variable with a name matching the key uppercase and prefix with the env prefix they've set. By default, empty environment variables are considered unset and will fall back to the next configuration source. To treat empty environment variables as set, use the allow empty. So if I remember correctly, what this basically means is that if you have this turned on, when you try to pull something from Viper, the first thing it'll try to do is see if there's an environment variable set and grab that first instead of pulling something, say, from like a configuration file or something. This is typically a behavior you want. A configuration file may have a lot of your like baseline settings, but you may want to overwrite them with environment variables or passing in command line argument flags like this. I didn't really go over this one right now because it specifically says they use this other package called pflags, which is kind of like an extended version of the standard flag package that Go already has, but it behaves it differently in some respects. I don't know. I either go over this thing specifically in another video, or I'll go over it when I'm talking about Cobra, which will probably be the next video. That's all I got for you today. If you remember to like and subscribe if you like the video, and to share it if you think it helps someone else. Join the Discord if you haven't. There should be a link. Pop on in there because there ain't hardly anybody in there. And I'm learning. I want to talk to somebody. And with that, y'all come on back now, and I'll see you next time.